Hello and welcome to The Key Role of Network Visibility for Zero Trust, sponsored by Gigamon. We've all heard a lot about Zero Trust, but there are two very special elements to this event. One is that we'll be hearing about an important next step in the Zero Trust journey having to do with data acquisition networks. The other is that one of our speakers today is the widely cited analyst John Kindervag, who is credited with developing the Zero Trust model back in 2010. So you'll be getting an update on the latest in Zero Trust, and you'll be hearing it from one of the world's foremost authorities on Zero Trust. So settle in for an excellent session today. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this special event. Before we get to today's groundbreaking content, we do have a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. Well, we've got too much content in the session to do a live Q&A at the end. We will make sure that any questions that you have get passed along to the Gigamon team. That Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues you might be experiencing. A browser refresh will fix most audio, video, or slide advancement issues, but if that doesn't work, let us know in the Q&A and we'll provide further technical assistance. Second, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, you'll find that we're offering several resources. I'd especially like to call your attention to 3 resources provided by Gigamon. There's a link to learn more about deep observability from Gigamon, which you'll hear a lot more about today in the context of its implications for Zero Trust. Then there's a PDF called Zero Trust and Importance of Network Visibility. That's a paper written by John Kindervag for Gigamon, and it's a great supplement to go deeper into the concepts you're going to be hearing about today. Finally, there's a case study on Zero Trust at the Department of Defense that Ian is going to touch on if there's time. This is a great collection of resources here, so be sure to grab those now. As a thank you for joining us, at the end of this webinar event, we will be awarding a $300 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. Official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section. Scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. Now finally, one of the best benefits of this event is the opportunity to ask a question of our expert presenters. So to help encourage your questions, we have a special additional prize for you. That's another Amazon gift card, this one for $50 for the best question. At the end of the event, we'll look at all the questions, pick out the very best one, and contact that prize winner. So with that, let's get to today's fantastic content. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our presenters today. Representing Gigamon is Ian Farquhar. Ian's been with Gigamon for almost 10 years. He's currently field CTO for Gigamon. He's also served as the CISO in an acting capacity last year, while the leadership team looked for someone to wear that hat full time. So he's clearly got great technical and security chops. His distinguished career has also included positions at RSA, Cisco, Sun Microsystems, and SGI. And as I mentioned earlier, we also have John Kindervag. John was a longtime analyst at Forrester Research, and his influential papers there developed the Zero Trust model. And he's widely name-dropped as the creator of Zero Trust. So John and Ian, it's great to have you both on. And John, I know you've got a lot to cover, so take it away.
Hey, thanks for that introduction, and it's great to be here, and I'm excited to be talking with my good friend Ian. We've never met in person, but we have spent a lot of time on Zoom. I'm in Texas, he's in Australia, and we've spent a lot of time. He's spent a lot of early mornings, late nights talking to me. I've occasionally reciprocated and stayed up a little past my bedtime to talk to him. But it's great fun to be here with you today, Ian. And I'm excited to be talking about Zero Trust and precisely some of the things that we've been doing together between me and Gigamon on adding the concept of data acquisition network back into the Zero Trust discussion. Because in the second Zero Trust report that I wrote at Forrester Research, it was called Build Security into Your Network's DNA. I said that we needed to collect as much data as possible, but it was very difficult to get the data. So we needed to build a thing called a data acquisition network. And here we are, 12 years later, 10, 11, 12 years later, and Gigamon came to me and said, hey, we saw this finally, and we think we have that. And I said, yeah, you do. And so we're resurrecting it, I guess. But I wanted to do just a couple of quick introductory things on what zero trust is. And the first thing to understand is this idea of trust. What is trust? Well, it's a hard thing to describe, right? This is what confuses everybody, because in a system called zero trust, we're trying to eliminate trust. I was pretty explicit about that. And we're talking about digital trust here, trust in anything on a digital system. So trust is a human emotion that we've injected into digital systems for absolutely no reason. And that makes it a dangerous vulnerability. And what do you do with vulnerabilities in your organization? Well, you mitigate them, don't you? And so the goal of zero trust is to mitigate trust, get rid of trust. Trust is a 4-letter word. And not only is trust a dangerous vulnerability, it's also an exploit. It is the only vulnerability that is also an exploit at the same time. Isn't that crazy, right? So what we're trying to do is get rid of this vulnerability and an exploit at the same time. Because remember, the only entities or the only actors who get value from trust in your organization are the malicious actors who are going to be hiding behind this cloak of invisibility that we call the trusted network. Now, we have a great example of that just came out in the news here recently. There was a big data breach from GoDaddy. And as they did the investigation, they found out that the attackers had been inside GoDaddy for 3 years. This is what we call dwell time. Dwell time exists because we're looking in the wrong places. That's why it exists, not because the attackers are doing anything specifically unique, right? I heard one person, I used the word cloaking earlier because I remember years ago one person said, well, they were cloaked. The attackers were cloaked. No, they were just doing their business in a part of the network that you didn't have any observability of. And so this is why we need to see all the packets, all the data, all the systems. So in Zero Trust, we have some basic design concepts. First, we want to focus on the business outcomes. We want to ask the question, what is the business trying to achieve? And so move your discussions up to a business level so that you can start to make cybersecurity a business topic, and Zero Trust especially. Zero Trust was designed to resonate to the highest levels of any organization, yet be tactically implementable using whatever the state-of-the-art best technologies were at any given time, because I always understood that the technologies were going to get better, but the strategy shouldn't change. And so we want to decouple the technology from the strategy. So Zero Trust is a strategy, first and foremost, that resonates to the business. Now, when we're building these environments, we want to design the environment from the inside out. We want to start with the data or assets we're protecting and move outward from there in our design. And we all learn to design networks with, from the outside in. We started with the edge. I'm old enough, and I'm guessing Ian is too, to remember when we couldn't get a direct internet handoff. So we had to figure out what WAN card did we need for the router. That was a big thing. What am I going to get handed off? Am I going to get ATM? Am I going to get T1? Am I going to get DSL? Am I going to get ISDN? There were all kinds of different ways that we were going to get traffic handoffs. And then we started just designing inward until we got to usually the access layer switches, and we stopped because that wasn't our job. And we said, hey, plug your stuff wherever you want to. We don't care. Take any open switch port, because we've made this very flat network, and now we don't even know where the data or assets are that we need to protect. So as we rethink this design methodology, we start with what we're protecting and move outwards from there. And then we need to determine who or what needs to have access, need to know. This is least privilege, but this term is overused, so I don't use it very much. The question is, should John have to have access to a particular data set or a particular asset in order to get his job done? That's how we should think about it. Do you need access to get your job done? And then the fourth thing we do is we inspect and log all traffic, and we do this up at layer 7. We need as much information as possible. And we do this so that we can instantiate a policy. Now, let's talk about inspect and log real quick, Ian, because I know you've been around for a long time. But we typically get this part of it, right? When we say inspect and log, oh, I'm just going to get some syslog messages. I'm going to log them in a standard logging database or something like that. But let's talk about some of the weaknesses of the way we do logging today as it relates to what happens if there's not a field to log the stuff that's being seen. What happens to it in the log management system?
Absolutely. It's one of the things we talk about is the mutability of logging. Logs are spoofable. If I take control over a workload, I can make it generate any log message I like. And it's like having a stranger in the street. You walk up to them and say, "Can I trust you?" And they say, "Yes, of course you can trust me." Should you believe that? Probably not. If you are dealing with logging, it's coming from inside the workload. And an attacker that controls that workload controls the logging as well.
Right. They often clean up the logs. But when there's something that has happened that the logging system doesn't understand, they just drop that. There's no field in most log management systems for stuff we don't know what to do with, right?
Yes.
Stuff that we don't know what to do with, we just discard. And so it's like, oh, it's all this important evidence at a crime scene, but we don't have any bags that big to put it in, so we're just going to throw it in the trash, right? And so, you would never do that. You're looking for every single thing in a crime scene. And you need to think about your network in a bit like a crime scene. And so, and we need to be up here at layer 7 because a lot of goodness is there. I mean, that's where the big attacks are happening. So that's why we look at these design concepts from that perspective. Now, the best visual representation I can give you about what we're doing in Zero Trust is to show you how the U.S. Secret Service protects the President of the United States. Now, this is an image from President Barack Obama's 2009 inauguration parade, but this gives me the best visual metaphor I've ever come up with to talk about it. So there's 3 things we're trying to understand here. We need to know who the president is, right? The Secret Service, they don't do presidential discovery projects, do they? They don't scam for the president. So that's the first question they're asking. The second question they ask is, where is the president at all times? They know exactly where the president is. They don't go, "Hey, Ian, we've lost the president. Have you seen the president?" No, that doesn't happen. And third, they know they need to know who should have access to the president at any given time. Now, these are the 3 fundamental questions you ask when you're protecting anything, whether it is the president of the United States or the prime minister of Australia, or it is data or assets in our various environments. So we can see here that, yes, there was a perimeter on this day, but look at this uniformed Secret Service agent. They have their hands in their pockets. They have their hats on. Why? Because it's cold outside. This was January 20th, 2009. And so these folks know they're not doing any real protection. They're just there to intimidate, knock down the low-hanging fruit, a little bit of security theater, right? We've heard that word, security theater. And it works for a certain degree. For the main group of people, there's all this security theater, even though it's not going to be effective against a determined attacker. Yeah, okay, I'm going to go away. But we need to understand this bigger concept, because where the real protection is being done is down at the bottom of this screen at the place that I call the protect surface. So the protect surface is the fundamental concept of Zero Trust. So on this day, there are 4 people in the protect surface: the president, his wife, and his 2 children. Notice the Secret Service has been able to shrink the attack surface down orders of magnitude to something very small and easily known, and that's these 4 people. And they will remain the protect surface. The beast, the vehicle, is just transport. Sometimes they're going to be transported by helicopters, airplanes. It doesn't matter. They are always going to be the protect surface, right? So once you understand the protect surface, the second thing you do is you move your controls in adjacent to the protect surface. We don't do this in cybersecurity. Our controls are typically on the perimeter or on an endpoint, which are a long way from the thing we're trying to protect. And this creates that secondary attack surface that we call the internal network. And this is why we get the concept of dwell time. Dwell time comes up here, right? Because in this area right here is where the attackers are doing their business and no one's looking, right? So in between there's nobody looking. And it wouldn't be a big deal if you had controls adjacent to the protect surface, but you don't. So you need to start getting some visibility into what's going on here as you move towards this zero trust environment. Now, once you have figured out to move your controls in, you can now define a microperimeter in policy. So the microperimeter is the second big tactical control that we're going to put in. Protect surfaces are protected by microperimeters that have very granular policy. So the policy is always deny all. We start with a deny all policy, and then we allow things to happen. So all policy is binary. All you can do is allow or deny. And so I've taken away 50% of your decision making. You start with deny all, and then you allow. So there's going to be two individuals who are allowed to transit outbound, these two Secret Service agents in the front of the beast. And there's exactly 0 people who can come in, right? Look at this Secret Service agent. No hands in their pockets, no hat on. The coat isn't buttoned up. Why? Because they have some security controls underneath those jackets. If you've seen any movies with Secret Service agents where they're going to enforce this deny all policy in real time. And so now we've got a very controlled environment about what's allowed to come into the microperimeter and get access to the protect surface and what's allowed to leave the microperimeter. But the Secret Service doesn't stop there. Notice what they're doing. They're continuously monitoring everything in real time. So they might look out here in the crowd and see that guy in the white shirt. He looks a little sketchy. So what do? You know, they tell there's somebody in here who's the main communicator, the command and control leader, and they say, keep a lookout for that. They're starting to get visibility. They're looking out. They're looking out everywhere, right? They're looking. They've got eyes in all 4 directions here to see what's going on. And this gives them visibility into threats. It also allows them to understand why they might need to change policy, because they can, this is sort of the central management platform, and they can say, hey, we need to change the policy to allow a new someone to come inside the protect surface and get through the microperimeter by policy, and then they can monitor what happens as a result of that. So they're constantly on the lookout, right? It's not just building the system down here, it's monitoring the system up here. And so this is a zero trust model of executive protection, and this is how you protect anything, whether it is the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of Australia, or data or assets or services, whatever you need to do. So this leads us into our 5-step model for deploying zero trust, right? This 5-step methodology is so important. If you understand this, you will be able to build zero trust environments. Zero trust is very simple. You just need to know the 4 design principles and the 5-step methodology. That's it, right? Ian and I both agree complexity is so dangerous and increases risks so much. So I tried very hard to make this very, very simple. Now, so what's the first thing we need to do then? Well, we need to define the protect surface. We need to ask, where is the president? So we need to say, what are we protecting? And the answer is called a DAS element. Now, you'll see this in guidance from the NSTAC report, from the NSA, from DISA, which is the Defense Information Security Agency. You'll see it everywhere. In most zero trust literature, the idea of DAS elements. This is to easily help you remember what goes into a protect surface, right? So we talk about data that is sensitive, applications that are sensitive, assets that are sensitive, or services that are sensitive. So we put a single DAS element into a single protect surface, and we build out our zero trust environment one protect surface at a time. You see, cybersecurity is a very complex problem, but we can solve complexity by taking this massive single complex problem and breaking it up into a lot of simpler problems called protect surfaces. And this makes zero trust three things. One, it makes it incremental. We're doing it one at a time. It makes it iterative. We're doing it one after another, and it makes it non-disruptive. The most we can screw up at any one time is a single protect surface. So you're not going to blow up everything. Everybody's afraid of blowing it up, but it's because they're starting too big. You eat the elephant one bite at a time, right? And so once we've figured this out, we can then map the transaction flows. That's the second step. We want to see how the system works together as a system. And that's hard to see because we don't have enough visibility at this point either, right? So this is where we're going to, if we had a DAN, like we've talked about, and there's a white paper that I've written with Gigamon, sponsored by Gigamon, about data acquisition networks. That's what we're going to be talking about here, and you're going to get that white paper. But if we have that, we can start to get more visibility, right? So we're getting it in visibility here, and then we create the environment, and by doing all of these three steps, that tells us what are the tools we should buy. What architecture should we have? I spend a lot of time talking to people, and they'll say, I bought widget X, gadget Y. Where should I put it? What are you trying to protect? I don't know. Well, every zero trust environment is custom made for every single protect surface, right? So I can't have a just generalized zero trust environment. I need to know what I'm protecting because that's going to determine what controls go in place. And then the fourth step is create policy. And one of the things I want to see is what traffic is already going to the protect surface, or what's trying to go to the protect surface, so I can determine that binary policy statement. Should I allow it or not, right? So I just turn on some allow rules, and everything else is a default deny. And so this makes it very, very, very simple and safe, right? Very protective of you, because, for example, there's typically not a rule that allows unknown traffic to come from an IP address on the internet that's unknown to get access to a sensitive resource. That rule just shouldn't exist. So that's how ransomware works. A command and control server is trying to drop ransomware onto your system, and it's an unknown system. It's at an unknown location, and it's sending unknown traffic and an unknown payload, and that should never get over here to the protect surface. So by creating this granular policy and having visibility, we can start to lock down those policies, and then finally, we monitor and maintain. This is where we take all the telemetry we can get. I call it the digital exhaust of our business, and re-inject it back into the system so we can make each part of this better and better over time. And this creates a feedback loop to make a system known as an anti-fragile system. So anti-fragile is a word I got from Fragile. Sometimes, folks, it is hard to write and spell. Well, for me, it's always hard to write and spell, but when you're doing it and talking on a webinar at the same time. But hey, we're live. So, but a man named Taleb wrote a book called Anti-Fragile, and he gave me the vocabulary to talk about this, because we can take systems that are fragile. We think about systems that are fragile. We have a piece of glass, and then we have systems that are robust, a rock. And when we throw a rock through a piece of glass, it breaks. But Taleb postulated that we can create separate systems, and he was doing this for financial markets, that were anti-fragile, and he uses the human body as an example. So our human body is an anti-fragile system. So if I need to lose weight, my doctor says, hey, you need to get your heart in shape, whatever. What I do is I stress my body, don't I? I lift weights, I run, I swim, I eat better, whatever I do, I put stressors on my body, and my body adapts to that stress and becomes stronger and stronger and stronger over time, because it's an anti-fragile system. And so Taleb gave me the vocabulary to talk about this, what I wanted to do in network design through zero trust is create anti-fragile network environments based upon protect surfaces. And so that's what we're doing. And that's why it's so important to have a data acquisition network, because I need to understand all these stressors so I can, hey, there's some information that I don't have and I can make my protect surface more clearly defined. Or I'm seeing some stuff and, oh, the system works a little bit different than I thought. Or, hey, look at this, I need a new control. Or I need to adjust policy. And then I can continue to do this over and over and over again. So at this point, why don't you take it away, Ian, and talk about what we've been doing together over at Gigamon.
Thanks, John. And yeah, let's reinforce one point, is that complexity is the enemy of security. Complexity makes things harder to secure. A lot of other bad properties too. Complexity destroys budgets. Complexity frustrates our architects and our incident responders. Complexity really is the enemy of securing something. I mean, this is fairly obvious that most people notionally get this, but we're dealing with really complex environments. And without wanting to drag people through the glass and taking your point about there being a simple 5-step process, nonetheless, we need to look at the complexity of the environments we are going to be securing with zero trust. And one of the things that I really observe in zero trust is that a lot of people who are very, very familiar with the networks and the parts of the network and the parts of the organization and infrastructure that they manage often have this weird familiarity bias in that they forget that there's other parts of the network, there's other parts of the environment, there's other parts of the infrastructure that they don't deal with on a day-to-day basis, but which need to be part of the zero trust journey. So most people look at complexity through the lens of on-prem versus public cloud versus private cloud, but there's a lot of detail in there. There's a lot that you need to deal with. So take public cloud. Almost everybody's doing public cloud, but most organizations are doing multiple public clouds. They don't want to commit to a single cloud service provider, move all their infrastructure there and find themselves hostage to that provider. So they have a multi-cloud strategy. Even with private cloud, many organizations have multiple hypervisors that they're running for a variety of reasons. On-prem networks, quite complex. It's more than just a data center. You can have departments, regional, tactical. If you're in the military, you might even have mobile environments, planes, ships, all sorts of things. Zero trust has to be part of that. What about greenfields versus brownfields? That wonderful term that we've imported from real estate, greenfields being something we build and brownfields being something we kind of are retrofitting and redeveloping. And the reality is that most things in that sort of dichotomy are actually hybrids. SaaS is another one. In edge cases, legacy compute to me is an important one. I was dealing with a bank that had a cloud-only strategy and they forgot that they owned a mainframe. When we have things like mainframes, we typically have things that are heavily loaded with data. Yes, the IBM Z60 is a beautiful piece of hardware, but you don't buy it because it's a beautiful piece of hardware. You buy it because it has incredibly sensitive information in it. You want to be able to secure this. BYOD, where you can't put EDR on it, IoT, OT, ICS, SCADA, all of these things are things that add complexity. John, are you seeing this? What are you seeing with most organizations?
Yeah.
Does this resonate?
Absolutely it resonates, right? Because this scares people. And they think that this complexity means that zero trust is going to be very hard. And, you know, there's a couple of things to think about, right? I mean, you talk about legacy systems. Well, they may not be cool, but they may provide business value. So if, you know, one thing that I tell people, if they provide business value, they're not legacy, right? We're looking for business value, and it's not about the cool, right? We want to get value. But one thing about all of these things is they're typically DAS elements or a place where a DAS element sits. So I can pull all of this stuff into the concept of a protect surface, right? So I have a protect surface that's sitting in AWS, and it's credit card data as part of my cardholder environment. And here's how it talks in a multi-cloud environment to these other parts of the system, say settlement or whatever. And they happen to be, some of them are on-prem and some of them are in another cloud. And so now I can think about how those three protect surfaces work together, and where do I need to put the controls, and how do I need to monitor that so I can make sure that there's not a data breach of the cardholder data. So again, all of this works in this 5-step model. You can figure out how to take all of these cases and take the complexity out of it by just saying, well, if I look at my cardholder data, it just happens to be in AWS. Zero Trust doesn't care where it's located. It doesn't care whether it's running on infrastructure as a service or a Z16, as you say in Australia, a ZOS system. It doesn't care. It doesn't care about any of those things. All it cares about is, what do I need to protect? That fundamental data assets. If it's a SCADA system, that's the thing I'm protecting, right? So it's a standalone thing, and so now I can protect the SCADA system. I can protect a PLC, an HMI. It just doesn't matter. So now I've just reduced a lot of the complexity, because I can start taking these things and understanding, for this protect surface, which one of those things are you using? So inverting the model, instead of worrying about, oh, look at all the things on Ian's slide, that's scary, I say, let's start with one thing that we're trying to protect, one data type or one asset. And you say, I need to protect the Z16, the mainframe, because my main banking application runs off of that. And if I tried to put it in the cloud, it would cost me $1 billion and I would never get that back. Okay, cool. And so there's ways of doing that. I've done a lot of mainframes for banks, for example. It's actually pretty simple, and it would be considered a brownfield thing, but we don't really care about all that kind of stuff. We just look at the business problem, and we look at the transaction flows, and then that tells us what controls to put in place. And so now we say who should have access, or what resources should have access to the mainframe, what asserted identities via what application, and then we create the policy, and now we monitor that to make sure that it's working right. And the 5-step model just worked perfectly for this vast array of use cases that you've shown me here, Ian.
Exactly. And that's really what we want to talk about today, which is how to reduce complexity, how to make these complex environments look a lot simpler and implement the 5-step plan. Because failure at scale here is just not an option for most organizations. We have to make this work, and we have to make it work reliably. But I firmly believe that that's actually relatively straightforward, and that's really what I want to talk about today. And in fact, what you wrote about in 2010 about the data access network, which is such a powerful concept.
Right, because what I saw was everybody would just say, just give me all your logs and I'll do this or that with it. Well, getting all the logs, that was the difficult, if not impossible problem. And then, we talked about it earlier, just getting all the logs isn't enough. There's a lot of stuff that I need that's not logs. And then people would say, because I'm a former network engineer too, I would want to get all of the switch data. Well, that's really hard to do, almost impossible. But I'll just hook up a sniffer to a span port. Well, here's what I discovered horribly in real life. When there is an attack on the network, what is the first thing that a switch does in its logic? It turns off the span port to take that memory and allocate it to the switch, because we care about keeping the switch up more than we care about understanding what bad things are happening to it, right? That whole CIA triangle, I joke that it's not an equilateral triangle, it's an isosceles triangle, and the C stands for compromise, because all we care about is the hypotenuse, which is availability. All anybody cares about is availability. No one really cares about security. So in order to meet those demands, we need to see what's going on, and we need some sort of way to get this information, all this telemetry, this raw telemetry, which is the packet itself, to some storage unit with all that raw, juicy data. And we do that with a data acquisition network using technologies. At the time I was thinking of the port mirroring technologies that Gigamon had, but I was actually thinking about those orange boxes, right? And how useful those were whenever I had them. But there's taps, there's other ways to do it. And now you can throw that stuff in a cloud too. And so this is perfect for what people need to get all of that juicy data so that we can do that 5th step monitor and maintain.
Absolutely. And you're right. Switches under load will protect the data plane rather than the monitoring plane. But one of the things that I've even seen in real world situations is under extreme loads, even the presence of a span port can actually cause packet drops on the data plane. Switches aren't built for monitoring. If you actually go to the original paper that Cisco developed inside itself, because I used to work for Cisco, span ports were meant to be for troubleshooting. They weren't meant to be pervasive visibility. And they're just not built for that. You need a specialized platform. But that's a great intro to this slide, which is really to talk about sources of truth. And I like to use the term sources of truth because that's what we're trying to determine. If we're driving trust out of things, we want to understand truth versus maybe something that I'm being lied about or spoofed. I want to understand what's really going on. And really, there are 3 approaches in InfoSec to determining what is going on, what is truly happening in an environment. The first is logs. Now, I'm been around a while and I was trying to figure this out, but I think the first incident response I ever dealt with was in around 1991. And it was on a Solaris system where I noticed that logging had been disabled. I actually have been trying to figure out where remote logging first appeared, and it's harder to figure out than you would think. But sometime in the mid-'80s with BSD Unix, I think, is most likely where remote logging came from. But it's a very old technology. It's a very familiar technology. A lot of the guidances we use are really based around logging. Logging comes from inside the operating system or the application. It tells us something that is observing happening. Contrast this to agents. Agents are where we take a built-for-purpose application, an agent that we run on some sort of workload, and it provides us telemetry of what it is observing on the system. Both are a form of telemetry that comes from inside the workload, and we traditionally call these observability. However, we have another approach to telemetry, and that is to look at the workload from the outside. What does this mean? This means that we look at the packets that are being sent by the workload, we characterize them, we process them to layer 7, as John said before, to understand behavior from the outside. From the inside, we call it observability. It's a common industry term. It actually goes back to steam engines of all things. But from the outside, Gigamon calls this deep observability. So observability, visibility of truth from the inside, and deep observability from the outside of the workload. But I want to look at truth. So therefore, I need to look at assurance. I need to look at how much I can trust the data I am getting from observability and deep observability. And one of the challenges is that because agents and applications run inside the workload, they are mutable. And what does that actually mean? What that means is that an attacker who gains control of that workload can spoof them. In that situation I dealt with in 1991, they turned off logging, so I couldn't see what they were doing. Back then, I didn't notice that the log messages weren't appearing in my central log server. Honestly, back then, no one was looking particularly commonly. But nowadays, we do actually look. We have seam and saw tools. But not only can I disable them, as the attackers at SolarWind did, if you look at the Mandiant report, I can even spoof them. I can generate fake logs. I can take my system logs and replay them in a loop. So it looks like the system just as continuing to do whatever it did leading up to the attack. And most people would not notice this. That's one of the problems of observability, of inside visibility. And that's why deep observability is so important. John, what's your thinking about this?
Well, that's why I created the idea of a data acquisition network, because the packet contains all that we can know about a network. A network uses TCP/IP protocol. It has a packet, and that is a finite thing. And so if we look at packets, we can have 100% view of what's happening. It's been hard to do that up until now. And we haven't wanted to do it. We wanted to do it the easy way, because a lot of these things are built into, syslog is built into most things. So you can just turn that on, point it to a syslog server, and bada bing, bada boom, you're done. So it was easy, but it wasn't effective. And you're right, packets are functionally immutable. I mean, I'm sure there's things that you could do to craft it if you could intercept it and things like that. But we have ways to validate input and output, and we can see all of that stuff in the packet. And it's just the way everything runs. And so you need to understand how a packet works and why it's so important, and then why you need to gather all the packets. As you look at the logs, when I was doing some research at Forrester, and I was talking about log systems in SIM, one CISO said to me, when I look at this, it's like looking at leaves at the bottom of a teacup. I know it's supposed to tell me the future, but I can't make heads or tails of it. And I said, oh, so you don't get any value from it? And he says, I really don't get any value from it. And I said, so you wouldn't buy this again if you had a choice? He said, no, I'd buy it again because if I don't have it, it makes me look like I'm an immature organization. He wasn't getting value. He wanted to have this perception. Well, we need value, and you can get value from those packets, and you can do amazing things when you see the packets and you analyze the packets in the proper way. And that's a common thing that people know how to do. So you aren't anymore looking just at the bottom of the teacup. You're getting actionable intelligence that you can then programmatically, in fact, automate to take an action or do something that makes your environment stronger and stronger over time. And we get into anti-fragile systems as a result of that.
And one of the things I like to talk about is that when you view a lot of architectures through a network operations viewpoint, you typically realize that your main adversaries are incompetence and physics. Someone screws up, or something fails, metal migration destroys a chip or something. When you're dealing with threat actors, you've got somebody who is malicious, has an informational advantage over you, is going to look at how they can get around everything you do. So yes, evasion will happen. But one of the things is about network visibility, about deep observability, is in accessing that system, they are generating network traffic. They can create extra traffic to sort of mask themselves, but they can't not generate the traffic that allows them to be there. Their very presence generates the evidence that allows you to catch them. It's a really powerful technique.
It really is, and I'm glad we're, in a sense, rediscovering it, or at least revocalizing that this is something that we need to do, because the industry forgot about it for a while, and we got so spun up into these logs that you can't operationalize. And even if you have all this data, how do you operationalize it becomes a big question. And so you need to have context to operationalize it, and then you need to know what to do with it. And you need, the things you do with it are, you either improve your policy or use it to understand why you need new controls or something like that. So there has to be an output from it, and a value from it. And again, that plugs into that 5-step model.
Absolutely. Let's just deep dive into some of the benefits that a DAN could actually give you. Monitor and maintain. Deep observability simplifies zero trust, and simplification is essential. We need to monitor and maintain these environments, as John said. If you take nothing else away, look at the fact that network traffic is a commonality across every single environment. Packets exist in these environments, whether they travel across a piece of fiber optic cable, across a piece of blue-colored copper, whether they travel in a hypervisor in a private cloud or over in Amazon, and who knows what Amazon is running. It doesn't matter. Once you get access to the packets, you can treat them in the same way. Network traffic collapses complexity. It's really quite incredible. It also supports devices which can't run EDR agents and may not be able to do even logging. We can't ignore these things that are just complex. We can't ignore these things. We've got to actually monitor them to properly maintain them. So things like the mainframe, which we talked about before, yeah, it can probably do logging. It probably can't run an EDR agent. Why don't we monitor it from the outside? Why don't we look at what it's doing on the network? What about IoT, OT, ICS, SCADA? I was Gigamon CISO for 5 months until a formal one was hired. I had to step into the role. I had a zero trust project. I looked around Gigamon's network. I saw 4,500 systems. I saw a ton of IoT. I saw video cameras. I saw environmental control systems. I worry about those. I need to make those part of my zero trust infrastructure. How do I do that if I can't get a log out of them? How do I do that if I can't put an EDR agent on them? Well, the only option is really to monitor them from the outside. And you can actually say, oh, but hold on, Ian, they don't actually contain data. I don't really care about them, but you actually should, because they can provide attack points and jump points into your network. If you go and have a look at, there was an old Wired article by a gentleman called Rob Joyce. Rob, at the time he was interviewed for this article, actually ran the NSA's Tailored Access Operations, TAO group. That's their hackers. They talked about loving HVAC systems. They used to get into them and attack networks from inside the HVAC systems. You can't ignore IoT, and if you do, you're taking a big risk. And finally, what about BYOD? Even in talking to DOD, they have BYOD in some parts of their environments. You can't probably put an agent on that, but you can monitor those devices from the outside. When they're on your corporate Wi-Fi, you can monitor them, you can look at them. It allows you to manage them. So it collapses complexity, and in one way, in that it allows you to treat these multiple environments, but it also deals with a whole bunch of those edge cases that were so difficult. So how do you collect traffic? As John said, it used to be difficult. Well, that's what Gigamon's been doing since 2004. We can collect traffic from any network in any environment and feed it to any tool in any environment. That's what Gigamon does. The ability to take that traffic, irrespective of whether it's running in Amazon, in Azure, in Google, in Oracle, whether it's in VMware, whether it's in OpenStack, it doesn't matter. Anything from 10 meg Ethernet to 400 gig Ethernet, we can collect it, aggregate it, filter it, and feed it to the tools needed to analyze it and support your zero trust infrastructure. It simplifies the complexity. Deep observability is essential for managing the complexity that you are inheriting and turning it into something you can consume and swallow and protect. But I want to deep dive into this a little bit more. And I want to talk about threat detection as we would do it in terms of zero trust. And shining the light on threats, I suppose, is the theme here. One of the things you see in almost all of the guidance around zero trust is a heavy focus on machine learning and artificial intelligence, particularly around anomaly detection. And it kind of makes sense. We are dealing with unknown attacks. The ability to look at large quantities of data and see of my 4,500 systems whether one of them is behaving unlike the others that it should be identical to. This anomaly detection is so critical. And if you think about it, if you've got logs from multiple environments, every log from Amazon versus Azure, every log from various different parts, and Zero Trust will always be a multi-vendor solution. Any vendor that tells you that they can do your entire Zero Trust infrastructure either doesn't understand Zero Trust or doesn't think you understand it. They're going to be in a different format. And as John said, if your tool doesn't understand the log, it's going to drop that log on the floor. It's just not going to ignore it. But because the traffic is all the same across these environments, I can process it the same. It all turns into exactly the same informational taxonomy. And no normalization is needed. So I can compare these environments really elegantly. I can see the same sort of behavior in Amazon versus on-prem to realize I have an attacker. I can treat the data in the same way, and I can roll it out much, much faster. The lack of need for normalization is really, really powerful, and that's something you only get if you do deep observability. Gigamon's application metadata intelligence product, which takes packets and turns them into metadata indicating transaction flows, will massively accelerate not only deployment, but the algorithms that process this data. The ability to see those transactions at a very high level makes them consumable. This is one of the technologies that Gigamon has introduced that makes this deep observability so much more practical. As I said before, it's much harder for an attacker to avoid detection with deep observability. They are generating network traffic to access the workload that they've compromised. Even an insider threat is doing something that is generating network traffic to progress what they're maliciously planning to do. They will be seen. And many people at this point, and it's an absolutely valid concern, will talk about, oh yeah, but isn't everything meant to be encrypted? And yeah, lots of the guidance is saying encrypt everything. And I'm a cryptographer by background. I love encryption. I want to see a world where encryption is ubiquitous. Gigamon gives you the ability to actually decrypt in flight SSL and TLS traffic. Transparently too, so you don't even know the encryption is there. The decryption is there. It just happens. And break and inspect. That's what we do. We can even do break and inspect and fix because we can feed it to inline tools in Decrypted that can remove attacks and change the traffic if you actually choose to do that. A high maturity technique that is done in government and is starting to filter down to the enterprise. This can be done pervasively, which is probably unlikely, but maybe driven by risks. So you might have a workload that is starting to look a bit dodgy. That's where we turn on, just for that workload, decryption, so you get to look at the plain text. And finally, let's just remember, supply chain attacks are a really big thing. It's a huge focus. Many of you will be aware of SBOM and all the rest of it. But there's other classes of attacks called implant attacks or below the firmware, where the attack is done in hardware or where the attack is done in firmware running on a microcontroller on the system. These are relatively common in government-type attacks, but they're never going to be seen by logging. It's just simply not credible. But deep observability will see these attacks. That implant that generates the command and control channel out of the Wi-Fi baseband controller, it will be seen on the network. It really adds an incredible ability to see attacks that the other techniques do not allow you to see. This is the power of deep observability. John, what's your thinking about the lack of normalization here? Do you think this is valuable?
Absolutely, Ian. And that's one of the big problems is normalization. Um, if we're talking about we're normalizing all these packets coming in, all these logs coming in, so that they fit our schema that we've pre-decided on, is one of the threats, because again, you can't see what you don't store, and if you don't store something because you don't have a field for it, then dang, that's not a good thing. So that's why I've always been about get the raw data, keep all the raw data, analyze all the raw data so that you can understand what to do when you have the raw data. And this is why I advocated for this so many years ago, and why I'm so gratified to see you and all the teams at Gigamon, um, really latch onto this data acquisition network concept, because they're not that difficult to build, right? I mean, the technology is there. It's just off the shelf technology. It works in clouds. It works on premise. It works in hybrid environments. It unifies a lot of what you're doing. And these are the important things that we want to get across. So, for those of the people who are watching this, what is the value of a data acquisition network? So that you can actually understand what's happening in your environment in a real world way, so that you can stop attacks before they become successful. So zero trust stops attacks from becoming a data breach, from becoming successful. We can't stop the attackers, right? We'd have to be the attackers to control that, but we can make an attack unsuccessful. And there's a lot of ways to do it, but you got to know that something bad is happening, and you have to have some information in order to make the decision on stopping it, right? And so this is about gathering the right information in the right time, putting it in the right context so that you can apply the right policy, and then that you can monitor that in real time, and so you can make really quick decisions and not do autopsies later on, because that's what I call a forensics examination or instant response. I always call that an autopsy, right? Because it's always done on the dead body. It's too late. We got to get in front of that attack curve. And that's why having a data acquisition network helps us get that information quick enough that we can actually stop the bad thing from becoming bad.
So before we close, I just want to go very quickly to a case study. And this is a really interesting one. It's available on Gigamon's website. The URL's down the bottom, and I'm sure it will be included in the pack for this webinar. This was one of the first pilots of Zero Trust done a couple of years ago, and they didn't build a DAN. They actually decided that segmentation was enough. That's fine. That'd degrade lateral movement, or so they thought. No network visibility, no deep observability at all. Problem is they brought a red team in, and that red team romped all over the network. They were able to laterally move, compromise the environments, and they simply weren't seen. As a result, the architecture was not deemed successful. Once they brought in Gigamon, once they built that DAN, the red team had nowhere to hide. They were seen, and success was granted. Really interesting case study. I recommend that you have a look at it. But one final thought before closing. I don't want to leave you with the impression that we are saying just do deep observability, just build a DAN. That's unrealistic. What we're actually saying is that multiple approaches will always be needed. A DAN is an incredibly powerful one, and I would suggest you start with that. Not saying don't do logging, not saying don't do agents. Yeah, absolutely do them. Zero Trust will always be a multi-vendor, multi-approach solution. But don't forget the network. The network is essential to a Zero Trust infrastructure. So, John, what should we leave our audience with? What realizations should we leave them? What insight from you as the founder of Zero Trust, as the person who derived the concept, what would you leave them with?
That you need to see all of the stuff that's happening in your environment, right? And that environment crosses networks. Networks exist in clouds. Networks exist everywhere. And it's all about the packet, really. And so you need to see what's happening in these packets. So you need to build a data acquisition network so that you can analyze it and get insight into how the system works and then what's happening in the system so that you can make that system anti-fragile. There's huge benefits to you in the long term for doing this. So from a technology standpoint, yeah, you're going to need multiple technologies, but you're going to have visibility into all those technologies. And this is the one thing that everybody's forgotten about, right? And so we can have great technologies, but if we aren't monitoring and maintaining them, it's just not going to work. So leverage that 5-step methodology. We've already shown you how having a data acquisition network is really important to step 5, and it's really helpful in all the steps. So build yourself a zero trust environment, leveraging the 5 steps, but you're going to need a data acquisition network to really make it successful.
Absolutely. Thank you, John. Really appreciate your time. Fascinating as always, and your insights are incredibly valuable.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and go forth and be zero trusty, everybody.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. And we've got a poll up here for everyone about any additional information you'd like to see from Gigamon. You can click on as many of those different resources there as you'd like. Okay, wow, John and Ian have really given us a lot to think about on zero trust and on deep observability. And just a reminder, if you want to capture some of the thought leadership you heard here and get more where that came from, in addition to these items in the poll, be sure to download those PDFs from your handouts, especially that Kindervag white paper on zero trust and the importance of network visibility. Well, I'll just give everyone a few more moments on these poll choices. All right, well, thanks everyone for filling out the poll. And before we wrap up, we have one more piece of business. It's the Amazon gift card prize drawing. And the winner of the $300 Amazon gift card is Eric Matulka from Nebraska. Congratulations to Eric. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Gigamon for making this event possible. And thanks as always for attending and for your great questions. That concludes today's event. Have a great rest of your day.